Hello, everyone. This is Gabriel. Welcome to Exploring the Quran and the Bible. I am speaking to you from my office at the University of Notre Dame, and I'm so excited to introduce you to this discussion with Dr. Emran El-Badawi. He's been on Exploring the Quran and the Bible before to discuss late antiquity in the Quran, but in this discussion, we discuss freedom of expression and Quranic studies. I consider this to be a super important topic. We discussed two elements. First, the context of the Muslim majority or Islamic world and some high-profile cases there, especially in Egypt, where scholars have been not only questioned, but even prosecuted for the views on the Quran. And then we discussed the context in Western Quranic studies, and I ask, is there a form of self-censorship in the field of Quranic studies? Friends, I get a lot of encouragement to go on producing this sort of content by the likes and the subscribers. So please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much. Hello, Dr. Emran El-Badawi. Thank you for being back on Exploring the Quran and the Bible.
Thank you so much for having me, Gabriel.
I'm really excited to have a moment to speak with you about the topic, especially of freedom of expression and Quranic studies. We're going to cover some of your work and some very prominent, well-known cases where freedom of expression in the Islamic world has been questioned, or situations in which scholars have, in fact, been prosecuted for their work. And then we're going to turn towards the end of our conversation. I mean, who knows what will happen, but at least as planned, to speaking about the Western context and whether there is something like self-censorship in the West. So that's the general plan, and you are just a terrific person to have this chat with, because you know about the scholarly worlds of the Islamic world, or in Arabic language scholarship, and also, of course, in the Western context. I'm going to do a brief introduction, and then off we go. So everyone, friends, Dr. Emran El-Badawi is Program Director and Associate Professor of Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Houston and Chair of Modern and Classical Languages. Did I get the department right?
Yes.
Okay, terrific. He founded the Arab Studies program at the University of Houston, and he has designed, implemented, and assessed degree programs in the Humanities and the Sciences. Dr. El-Badawi also served, and this is super important to me personally, as founding executive director and treasurer of the International Quranic Studies Association, which is the world's first learned society of its kind. Part of the goal of IQSA, that's the acronym, is to bridge the divide between scholars in the West and those in Muslim majority countries through international conferences, also through publications, and through bringing people together. And so that's sort of connected to what we'll be speaking about today. Dr. El-Badawi has a bachelor's degree in computer science from Rutgers University, and he received his PhD with honors in Near Eastern languages and civilizations from the University of Chicago. I think your PhD director was Fred Donner, is that right?
Correct.
And Dr. Fred Donner has recently appeared on Exploring the Quran and the Bible. Okay, so super interesting publications. There's a long list, so I encourage everyone to look up, I think on academia. You're on academia, is that right?
Yeah, you can find my stuff there.
And some publications there. So all sorts of works on the Quran, Islamic studies, and actually, ranging and more broadly than that. His books include the Quran and the Aramaic Gospel Traditions, published by Routledge in 2016 and translated into Arabic by Dar al-Arabiya in 2020. And he edited a really interesting book that we spoke about in our first conversation a bit. So make sure you look at that first conversation, Exploring the Quran and the Bible, Communities of the Quran. And then big news, everyone, his most recent book is now published from One World. So that's 2022. The title is Queens and Prophets, but there's a subtitle. Could you help me with the subtitle?
Yes, sure. It's Queens and Prophets, How Arabian Noblewomen and Holy Men Shaped Paganism, Christianity, and Islam.
So we're going to hopefully have a third conversation with Dr. El-Badawi to really focus on that book. But why not go ahead and buy that book right now? It covers all sorts of interesting things, the intersections between pre-Islamic Arabia, and especially the role of prominent women therein, and early Islam, the Quran, but also the wives of the Prophet and other really important female figures in early Islam. So by Queens and Prophets. Okay, of special interest to us today is an article that Dr. El-Badawi published in the Italian journal Oasis in 2018, entitled Intellectual Freedom in the Study of the Quran, which is basically what we are up to. So I'd like to start with that, if that's okay, and just read a little bit from the beginning, where you make the case that the Quran is for freedom of expression. So you write, quote, "The context in which the Quran came to light, as many of its own verses indicate, features the presence of numerous religious groups, including Jews, Zoroastrians, Sabaeans, and other ancient sects. Not surprisingly, the text challenges the believers of those pre-existing religions, appealing to their intellectual sensibility and inviting them to a new vision of the faith. Faith is established only after meditating on the creation of the heavens and the earth, examining the signs they contain. The Quran contains dozens of verses that invite the reader to assess its message." And then you quote some of those. "Do they not ponder the Quran?" Quran 482. "Surely in that are signs for people who reflect." It offers the listener several proofs and counterproofs, never impinging their full-fledged freedom. Many verses convey the disappointment of the messenger, frustrated by the absence of the very faith which he was preaching. And then I'm just going to add it. But, however, how does the Quran respond to this disappointment? By repressing freedom or imposing the doctrine of Abrahamic monotheism? Not at all, for the opposite is true. So, okay, I just want to start by reading that and ask if you could expand a bit on your case that the Quran is for freedom of expression.
Thank you so much, Gabriel, for an overly generous introduction and for saying, buy my book. You're my best friend today. I promise your audience you were not paid to say that. And I welcome, of course, any future discussion, criticism, and so on and so forth. I thank you also for reading out of my humble article, which, though written, I think, from the heart, and I think out of years and maybe even decades of research, it's my most translated and circulated article. It's translated into several languages, and I'm very happy about that. I guess when I reflect upon the passage that you read, I want to link with, actually, it's probably your earlier meeting with Fred Donner, which you mentioned or just now in your introduction. Fred, of course, has a book on his theory, of course, on believers becoming Muslims and the believer movement, and talking about how there was a certain ecumenism and ecumenical movement. And of course, the term is problematic, as he mentioned in the discussion with you. But there is some valence to that idea. The Quran is revealed to an audience of, naysayers and, a hodgepodge of Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, pagans, different Sabaeans, different groups that we until today continue to debate. So if that's, if sort of the word of God, so to speak, is revealed to those people and it's negotiating with them, we should embody that same attitude today. So the ecumenical, that's sort of one part, and I'm stealing a little bit from your earlier interview with Fred. The other part, of course, is faith after reflection. Is that the Quran is, and you will know this, Gabriel, from your own research and from other areas, other sort of related fields like Syriac Christian studies, patristics, and that there's a certain homiletic effect within the Quran where it's constantly, it's going back and forth with the audience. The audience of the Quran are not these illiterate know-nothings. They are sophisticated elites in the society. Again, something we can debate. But it's arguing with them, and it's saying, have you not seen, the firmaments up in the sky? Have you not seen the, the valleys and the mountains and the camel and the trees and the figs, all to appeal to their intellect, and then say, oh, by the way, now it's time to believe. And as you mentioned towards the end of the passage, if people don't believe, what does the Quran say? Is there a punishment for people who don't believe? No, not once, ever. The language, of course, is that, if you don't believe, then God will judge. And if there's a dispute between people, God will judge and he will be equitable. If you're being stubborn and not going to believe, then, there's the punishment of hellfire as long as God wants, and so on and so forth. So it's not all, roses and fun and games. But as far as we are on earth, God does not need lawyers or angry men to persecute people in his name, according to the Quran. I don't see any of that in the Quran. So yeah, that's basically in a nutshell.
Great. Okay. Now, in the article as well, you make the case that efforts to impose religion and to suppress freedom of expression on religious matters lead to, on the one hand, atheism, and on the other hand, something like fundamentalism. It's a contested term, but let's just use it for now. People forgive us. So can you explain that? And could you comment on whether we actually see that happening today in places such as Egypt, which we'll discuss further as we go along, where there have been people prosecuted for expressing their own views on religious matters? Does it actually play out, let's say, on the Egyptian scene today?
Yeah, so big sort of hot button questions. And in the article, I do make the case, and I do believe it is the case, that compulsion, a certain, whether it's social, it's political, or it's legal, that, you know, if you're going to force me as a citizen of country X to pray or eat or fast or you know, give or not give, or dress or not dress a certain way, that does immediately cause a sort of reaction, a counter reaction. That's basically it. And I think that's human nature. You know, why is it that when God tells Adam, you know, in prehistory, don't eat from this tree, he's like, I wonder what's it like to eat from that tree? You know, I mean, so it's really something, it's really just a testament of human nature. There are at this point several studies, and even a recent article, which I think I sent you, Gabriel, but I mean, several studies looking at, you know, waves of atheism going through the world, going through the Middle East, Iran, Saudi Arabia, other countries which are, you know, very sort of conservative. And they provide the data, but they don't necessarily provide, I think, some of the more nuanced discussion of why is it that you know, atheism, or on the other hand, as I would mention, you know, fundamentalism, I would say now a little bit less so. We can discuss why. Why is it that atheism or fundamentalism, why is it that the extremes arise in a place like, you know, let's say Egypt? Egypt, of course, is a very important country. It's the most populous Arabic speaking country. It's one of the big three for modern Middle East if you're studying it, and it's one of the big five if you're studying Islam and modernity. This is what I tell my students all the time. Very, very important country, a very important country for many purposes. And so some of this is based on data, and some of it, of course, is just based anecdotally and looking, of course, at the political scene, looking at the Arab Spring, looking at the rise and fall of ISIS, the so-called Islamic State, right, of Iraq and Syria, and looking at waves again of Islam, of you know, Islamic fundamentalism or extremism, whatever you want to call it, and atheism. The idea that there is some sort of legal or brute force attached to religion does elicit a reaction. And that reaction, I have argued in the article, is different forms of religious extremism or atheism.
So could you speak anecdotally for a moment, because I think you know Egypt pretty well. I mean, do you find people interested in either explicitly atheist thinkers or just critics of religion? I mean, we could name some names that I've heard of anecdotally, but I don't know Egypt that well. I mean, have you met people who are really interested in this sort of anti-religious angle? And likewise, do you find people sort of drifting towards Salafism, attracted to Salafism, maybe in part in response to a perceived threat of atheism?
Wow. Okay. So there's a couple of questions there. Let me take the last one first. So, I mean, have I witnessed and have I been subject to, and have I studied and, you know, and you know, discussed with Egyptians the spread of Salafism? And I mean, of course, it's everywhere, right? To the point where, and you may want to come back to this later in the interview, but, you know, in the 1990s, the spread of Salafism, I would say the 80s and the 90s, was severe, and there was also a concomitant rise in terrorism, religious-based terrorism, where, you know, people were being killed, Egyptians and non-Egyptians, and in some cases even terribly, right? Tourists, mainly Europeans and Americans, and, you know, people, others, as a result of the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in Egypt in a particular context. I think that in recent years, because Egyptians and I think, you know, citizens around the world have witnessed the atrocities that, you know, religious fundamentalism can cause, the pendulum swings the other way now. So people are exploring, what does it mean to disbelieve? What does it mean to explore new ways of faith? I receive questions and emails and phone calls all the time from people in the region, people in the Gulf, people in Egypt, people in other Muslim-speaking countries. All the time, they're like, Dr. El-Badawi, you know, we know that you're an academic with you know, an open mind and no agenda, and you know, we want to know, how is it that you know, how should we believe as Muslims in this modern world? How is there another way? Show us another way. From France, I get that all the time, right after the Arte show. So I have lots of anecdotal experience in that regard. Real quickly about atheism, I don't really think there is sort of like a school of atheism or anything like that. That's also something to keep in mind. I think that there more research needs to be done on this. What does it mean for, you know, Egyptian citizens to really shy away more from traditional responses or responsa to, you know, Sharia-based answers to everyday questions today, and look more towards Western studies on the Qur'an and, you know, more critical intellectual approaches to their own faith. I don't necessarily think all of that is atheism, but some of that gets mislabeled a little bit.
Right.
And yeah, is there a hunger for that? Absolutely.
By the way, you mentioned the Arte show. Just thought I decode that in case people don't know that this is a program called Jesus and Islam, which is available, I think, in French, English, and German, in which Dr. Badawi, myself, and a number of other figures feature. I imagine you can find it on the internet somewhere. So originally in French, Jésus et l'Islam, Jesus and Islam in English, and there's a German version of it too. Okay, so stepping back a bit in time, you alluded to the 1990s, so let's go there. The most famous case, at least in the West, I think, from the 1990s in Egypt is that of Nasr Abu Zayd. Both of us met Abu Zayd. We had the honor of meeting him in the early 2000s, I think around 2006, 2007, something like that.
Sounds about right.
When he came to a conference at the University of Notre Dame and gave a really brilliant lecture that was responded to by the Iranian scholar Abdul Karim Soroush. So now the case, as many will know, was that his works collectively, and we could speak about some of them, maybe the most important or influential in this case was his work Mafhum an-Nas, Dirasa fi Ulum al-Qur'an, led to impiety, free thinking, fitna, discord, things like this. So he was denied promotion, and then at his university, and then declared an apostate in 1993. He left supposedly for sabbatical, but in fact for good, probably for good reason, since there were attacks, as you mentioned, on those accused of impiety. One of the figures that was important in his prosecution was a professor, I think, at the University of Cairo, named Abdul Sabur Shaheen. We'll get back to Abdul Sabur Shaheen. I don't know where we should start. Do you want to speak about Abu Zayd's thought or the case generally? And, you know, the legitimacy of the case? It was really a challenge to religion and his ideas about the Quran.
Wow, you know, thank you again for introducing all the details, and I want to thank you also. The meeting I had with Abu Zayd was thanks to you, the conference that you convened, and of course I had corresponded with him before that, and he left us too soon. Of course, he's passed away, and it's very tragic. But I also want to mention, of course, that I think Nadia Awaidat has a dissertation about Nasr Abu Zayd, which everyone should read and check it out. She's a great scholar, and of course so was he. I mean, what is there to say? The case, of course, I'll add a little bit more details to what you're describing. Nasr Abu Zayd was a brilliant scholar who, you know, worked not just in Quranic studies, but you know, the sort of intellectual tentacles spread to Arabic literature, theology, philosophy, you know, other areas where he was just, you know, any one of these areas he could have been, he was really sort of a master. And he did his master's, his PhD, Cairo University. He got appointed assistant professor. He started moving up through the ranks very quickly and with, you know, flying colors. He really, really was a great academic, and his research was very strong. And then he came up to his final promotion, a full professor, he writes this book, of course, Mafhum al-Nas, the understanding of the text, the concept of the text, which really is a very regimented, axiomatic, basic study of how to study the Quran, the moving parts of the Quran. And it's the only text of its nature in Arabic, where it's discussing very complicated things in very simple language. I loved reading that book. And, you know, just to dwell on the book just a little bit, or to discuss it briefly, I mean, he has something like, you know, called Aliyat al-Nas, the tools, the instruments of the text. It's fantastic, you know? And as you will know, because you know the text as well, that, you know, he does separate, there's a certain a layering that he does within the text to make it seem to the, you know, uneducated reader that, you know, there's sort of like, there's the Quran that is sort of up in the sky, and there's the Quran which is here on earth, which is completely man-made. And that's really where the problems begin, right? So this book, which he writes for promotion to full professor, which, you know, you Gabriel, are full professor, you'll know, right? You didn't hit the stumbling block, but it would be like an academic within one of our institutions accusing us of apostasy, and then it goes to the president of the university, which is what happened at Cairo University, and then the series of events that you described. It went to the Sharia-based courts, and the shocking thing. There's two things that are shocking that happened in that case. One, he was summoned to the court case to prove that he was a believer, a Muslim, which, I mean, he is a Muslim, right, by default. And in order to do that, he was basically summoned, and he was summoned to show up in court and declare the testimony of faith, the two shahadas, to declare that God is one and that Muhammad is his messenger. He refused to show up in court. And he refused because those of us who are intellectuals understand exactly what that means. This is not the way you resolve that issue. I may be a Muslim and I may be able to say that testimony of faith, but I am not doing it there. What happened actually was he did not declare that testimony of faith in court, but at a talk a couple of months or over a year later in Egypt, he began his talk by opening, you know, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the gracious, the beneficent, and then declaring the testimony of faith. He did it to the public, but he would not do it to the Sharia courts because that was an unjust case for him. And of course, he was declared an apostate. And the shock number two, which is the bigger shock, actually was in absentia, he was divorced from his wife. And as you know, that it dissolved his marriage in the Sharia court. And within a couple of years, him and his wife, had to leave Egypt. As you mentioned, again, it was like a sabbatical, but in essence, it was really a self-declared exile. It was no longer safe. He was, during the last few months, under 24 hours, sort of surveillance and security, and it was no longer tenable for him to be in the country. And then after that, of course, those of us really who could receive him in these free Western, countries, so to speak, had conferences and interacted with him, and he published with us.
And I think Ibtihal Yunus, his wife, continues to be active in continuing his legacy and her own legacy as an intellectual, and has become an important figure as well in her role.
Absolutely. Great.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably not the right time or place to get too far into his arguments about hermeneutics. As you alluded to eloquently, he speaks of the text becoming insani. Once it's revealed, it's then sort of becomes possessed and interpreted by humans, and including by the Prophet himself, but also by the community of believers. And then he's very insistent in his works, including a work called Al-Khitab that we published after he left Egypt in 2000, about the importance of hermeneutics and understanding culture, the cultures of the text and things like that. So okay, well, I want to just mention that Abdus-Sabur Shaheen, who was one of his opponents and apparently fierce prosecutor, although I don't know this situation as well as you do, he ran into trouble himself. So this is one of the ironies of contemporary Egyptian history. When he published a book in 1998 called Abi Adam, so my father Adam, قصة الخليقة بين الأسطورة والحقيقة, my father Adam, the story of creation between myth and reality. So that's just, that's just an irony. I could speak a little bit about that. What I know is thanks to the article of Suhaib Saeed, who's appeared also on this program, published, I think, in the Journal of Quranic Studies, but someone might correct me in the comments there, on Abdul Sabur Shaheen. So I just want to point out this irony. I don't know if you want to comment anything about that or the Shaheen case. I could say a couple of things. Or
let me add a little bit, and then I want to come back to you, Gabriel. Okay, so yes, I have some things to say. Real quickly, one last point about to segue between Abu Zayd and then Shaheen, of course. Abu Zayd did write another book in 1995. I'm not sure which side of the border he was, in Egypt or out. I think by then he was gone. Al-Tafkir fi Zaman al-Takfir, of course, which is, of course, in thought in the age of, takfir, this apostasy.
Declaring apostasy.
Which he just, he goes on about that. So, as you mentioned, this is one of the ironies again. One of the authors, Abdul Sabur Shaheen, who is also an academic in the University of Cairo, begins the attack that ultimately, takes down within Egypt Abu Zayd. And, years later, he writes this book, Abi Adam, which you mentioned, of course, which in the title, even in the subtitle, has, of course, is Al-Ustura wal-Haqiqa. You're introducing the concept of mythology and reality. So already, people's ears are like, what's going on over here, But the book, I have, quick aside here, I worked, of course, with Mahmoud Ayoub, who we talked about briefly last time, at Temple University in Philadelphia. And I was looking for this book, Abi Adam, because I was writing, actually, one of my first projects as a grad student was writing a paper about Adam. And he basically recommended I read this book called Abi Adam. I thought it was fascinating, right? I had some adventures with that book, but I didn't realize all the controversies behind it till afterwards. The book itself is one which accepts that Adam was a Nabi and Rasul from day one, according to sort of what you can extrapolate from the Quran. Fine. But then he's like, well, what about before Adam? What about all the stuff? And he does sort of get involved in, traditional Muslims would say maybe even mired in like Israeliyat and things like that. But he starts to look at what does it mean, Allama Adam al-Asma, as it says, in Surah Al-Baqarah. You're teaching or you're learning these names of pre-existing creatures. That means there's a pre-existence before Adam. And he goes deeper and deeper and deeper, and he starts looking at a sort of theology-based evolutionary history of Adam and humankind, which I liked. I thought it was nice, fine. I didn't appreciate that he attacked Abu Zayd, but that's a separate issue. And I want to mention that Shaheen himself is a very Sharia-minded person. He is not someone who is trying to ruffle any feathers. And it reminds me, actually, some of his evolutionary-based ideas within Islamic tradition, embedded in Islamic tradition, remind me of Ibn Khaldun, of Biruni, Jahiz, even going back, maybe to look at Galinos, right, and his, medical treatises. But traditional Muslim scholars have talked about evolutionary, histories to humanity forever. And I just took Shaheen's as one of those. But of course, again, the public in Egypt had trouble accepting it, but it's not really the public again. It's scholars in Al-Azhar, certain scholars within Cairo University, certain Islamic groups like Al-Jama'ah Al-Islamiyya, the Muslim Brotherhood later on. These are the ones who, there's the same names that constantly, they're the rabble-rousers, right? And they rise once again and they attack Abdul Sabur Shaheen, but he manages to sort of, deftly sort of turn it around and come within the fold again. I'm one more named Mustafa Mahmoud, of course. This is someone who was a scholar, a public figure who was very Marxist in his thinking in his younger years, but then was sort of chastened later on by these powers that be, the same rabble-rousers, and sort of repented and is now sort of, became a good Muslim towards the end of his life. He passed away a long time ago. Abdul Sabur Shaheen is one of those, and is qualitatively different than Abu Zayd. Abu Zayd is someone who was a true academic and lived by the critical spirit until his very last day.
I think Abu Zayd had enormous following in many contexts, but including Indonesia, and hopefully I'm getting this correct, but I think he might have passed away in Indonesia when he was speaking there. So it's just important to emphasize that among theologically minded Muslims, there was great interest in Abu Zayd, and Abu Zayd had great interest in having theological conversations. So this is different than some anti-religious figures that are explicitly and comfortably so being anti-religious. Yeah, I wanted to comment a little bit about this question of power and authority, because actually Suhaib Saeed in his article on Abdus Sabur Shaheen, he makes the point at the end that, well, how would things have gone differently for Shaheen, who, by the way, also passed away in 2010. So we've lost him as well. Same year, it was a difficult year for prominent Muslim intellectuals, because same year Abu Zayd passed away, and I believe Muhammad Arkoun also in 2010.
Muhammad Arkoun, Muhammad Abd al-Jabari, yes, there's a lot of
wow.
Exactly, all in 2010.
So I mean, Suhaib Saeed makes the point that how would things have gone differently for Abdus Sabur Shaheen if he didn't have the institutional backing, the authoritative, the friends in high places, male privileges, things like that. How would things have gone differently? And I just mentioned that because I remember a conversation I had with my with a sheikh who was teaching me Qur'an and Tafsir many years ago. And gosh, it was in the late 90s. So we could have been speaking about Abu Zayd, but I can't really remember now. There was something about a question of a book being banned in Egypt. I think there might have been the story that started it. Was I went to a bookstore in Damascus once, and I found one of Abu Zayd's books, and on the shelf, and I brought it to buy it, and the guy said, you shouldn't buy this. And I was like, but it's in your bookstore. And he's like, no, this is the bad man. You shouldn't buy this. And I was like, well, I'm buying it. So he accepted the money finally, but reluctantly so. Anyway, so my instructor said something like, well, listen, the people in Egypt are very religious. And so people should not try to impose upon them, I don't know, free thinking or irreligious thought. I forget what word he used in Arabic at this point. So, and I just thought that's an interesting narrative. Now, many people in Egypt, not all, but many people are very religious. And of course, religious language soaks through. The Adhan is heard everywhere from many directions, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, that's true what he's saying, but there are also elements of power in the suppression of freedom of thought. It's not simply a jumhur, the people, a shab, who are demanding that these books be banned or these people be prosecuted. I don't know if that rings true with you. I just thought I'd add that.
Yes, and thank you, Gabriel, for expounding, on providing a lot of wisdom. I actually have power in my notes over here towards the end, but you've gotten to it very early, and absolutely. I mean, power, gender, privilege, patriarchy, it's all there, right? I hope we can come back to this also. Before we end, I want to say something about it, but this saga of intellectual freedom, of publishing critical research, with a conscience in Egypt, has a very long history. And the backlash from especially institutions of power against intellectuals, lone intellectuals, it does, has a history of over a century, maybe even 150 years, if I can mention a couple. So if we go in reverse order, we've mentioned, of course, Abdus Sabur Shaheen. There is Ali Mabrouk, who passed away recently, just, unfortunately, health reasons and also a tragic loss. But he has his book again, Nusus Hawla al-Qur'an, where it's a good critical research on the Qur'an. And within ICSA, the organization that the both of us co-founded, we got to publish part of it as well, the Arabic text. We've talked about Nasr Abu Zayd. There are others, again, in the Egyptian context, like Farag Fouda in the 1990s, who was killed, right? By Al-Jama'a al-Islamiyya. This is the intersection of intellectual freedom and terrorism, right? This is one they came to a head. It also intersects with Nawal al-Saadawi and her whole discussion really on sex and women in Egypt. She was just probably I can think of like the bravest woman alive, who again has passed recently. And she was good friends with Farag Fouda. This is also in the 90s. There was Sayyid al-Qimadi, who also passed away recently, within the past year or two. And he wrote about Hizb al-Hashimi. Again, he talked about, this is a little bit different, but he looked at Islamic history and talked about the Hashemites, the people of Muhammad as a political party, again, fundamentally relating to politics and power. And he was attacked viciously. The stories, again, are sort of endless. If we go even further back, there's a distinction again. There's Cairo University, an institution of power, and then there's Al-Azhar University, an ancient institution of power. If we continue with Cairo University, before Abu Zayd, of course, there was Amin al-Khuli, who was the director, forgive me, the advisor of Muhammad Ahmad Khalafallah's book, of course, Al-Fan al-Qasasi fi al-Qur'an, looking at aesthetics in Qur'an. Again, they were attacked. They were, the same rabble-rousers came, took them down, and they had to move somewhere else. And before that, of course, there's the famous case of Taha Hussein, fi al-Shi'r al-Jahili, and then the book changed to fi al-Adab al-Jahili, of course, the book that he published initially in English about pre-Islamic Arabic poetry, and then pre-Islamic Arabic culture. He had to change the title because, just a quick anecdote, within the book he argued, or he didn't even argue, it's really a tangent, mentioning that the story of Abraham and Ishmael or Isaac is again like a story of mythology, or sort of it's a story rather than history. And he was attacked and sacked from his job, and he had to come back again and apologize, all these things. That's within Cairo University in the 20th century. If you look at Azhar University, you have Muhammad Abu Zayd. So is a different Abu Zayd, also got in trouble. His book, of course, was Al-Hidayah wal-Furqan fi tafsir al-Qur'an bil-Qur'an. This is the idea of interpreting the Qur'an using the Qur'an itself. Okay, doesn't sound very, controversial, but it's just the idea that I'm not going to use tafsir, the traditional exegesis. I'm not going to use hadith, the traditional forms of prophetic wisdom. I'm going to use the text itself. Again, he was attacked viciously and so on and so forth. Prior to him in the 19th century, you have Mahmoud Shaltut, you have Muhammad Abdu. These folks, were some of the modernizers of of Egypt itself. And they were attacked, continuously. So it's almost like, the history of thought in Egypt is the history of, intellectual persecution itself. Something for us to keep in mind and give us pause that this is not one-off. Abu Zayd, in one of his many, many interviews, you can find them on YouTube. You can research it. You can read his writings, which are fascinating, all of them. One day he was upset. He was fed up with all the persecution. He went up to a colleague of his. This is before he left. He was in Cairo University. He said, "You know what? Everybody owes me an apology." He was broken. And his colleague looked at him and says, "Why?" He goes, "Because of everything that I've been through." He goes, "If in that case, everyone owes every single Egyptian citizen an apology." And he was like, "You're right." Because the sort of atmosphere of persecution, of repression of freedom and freedom of thought, it extends to everything. How can you be an honest man or woman in this world and get things done without corruption? And so it's connected to a very complicated environment, which involves power, corruption, institutions,
and the point you make in the Oasis article, which I think is on your academia site, and I'd encourage everyone to read, it is in part that the narrative used by those who would like there to be limitations on freedom of expression is that the Islamic order and the well-being of the religion, which is linked from this more Islamist point of view to the well-being of society, is threatened by anything that will sow seeds of doubt or dissension. And so it can be, just to take the case of Shaheen's book, it's very, like in Arabic say, khafif. The challenge is khafif. It's light. It's not really calling everything into question. He speaks about the possibility that there was some sort of evolution that led to Homo sapiens. And that helps us to make sense of the fossil record, because of course we have fossil records going back millions of years of different stages of development in the hominid species. But he does not accept evolution broadly. So he doesn't accept that that hominids themselves developed from other primates and split off, as we know, from chimpanzees and others historically. So it's khafif, but it could be enough to cause, and I think he explicitly denies Darwinism. So but the narrative is that the well-being of society is too important, and that's a narrative just just to say that is actually analogous to other sorts of authorities. It's been present in the West in different contexts. It's present in different contexts, for political reasons, that any sort of political freedom of expression could lead to destabilization and threaten the well-being of society. Okay, I want to just transition. We'll take about 13 minutes more, I think, 12 or 13 minutes. And I want to transition to the Western context. So I sometimes make the case that freedom of expression in Quranic studies and critical Quranic studies is super important in the Western context, or outside of situations such as Egypt, which you've been discussing, because if it doesn't happen there, it's not going to happen at all. If you don't have full freedom of expression, if in organizations like the International Quranic Studies Association, then it's just not going to happen. And so there's added pressure upon intellectuals, Muslim or non-Muslim, working on the Quran in the West to embrace the historical critical method. Now, it doesn't mean that I'm sorry, hopefully this is not turning into a lecture, but it doesn't mean that there isn't a place for Islamic theological reflection in the West as well. But one should not exclude the other. So I want to speak about, is there in fact any form of limitation freedom of expression in the Western context in Quranic studies? I want to start with an anecdote, another anecdote, if you'll forgive me for this, which is that when we published first the Quran in its historical context, which is based on, I think, 2005 conference that had, a number of interesting articles in there, and we wanted to publish it in Arabic. So okay, let me give just a couple of details of the story because it's kind of entertaining. I went to a bookstore, a well-known bookstore in Beirut, and I was like, listen, I have this work of sort of critical Western scholarship on the Quran. Who will publish it? And he said, oh, I've got the perfect place for you. I'm not going to name names just so I don't ruffle any feathers. It's this publishing house run by a socialist who's anti-religious. He's an Arab nationalist socialist. He's not interested in religion. He'll publish anything. So I went there and I shared the manuscript, said, this is great, it's super interesting. I already had the translation done. So he read the translation, super interesting, but let me just check with this one prominent Muslim intellectual just to get the okay. And this Muslim intellectual told him, listen, it's impossible that you publish this without adding a rad, a refutation, pointing out the errors of the book in the beginning. And so that was the offer. He came back to me and said, we'll publish it, but we need this prominent Muslim intellectual to write the refutation. I was like, no, thank you. And it was finally published with Dar al-Jamal, and I encourage everyone to find it and buy it. I think it's been pirated online, so you can probably download it for free somewhere. Okay, what do you think about this question? The context is quite different, of course, in the Western Academy, but is there something like self-censorship in Western Quranic studies?
Again, another big question about which I think, Gabriel, you have a lot to say. And thank you again for the anecdote, because I know the names, so I'm putting them in my head and I'm enjoying the story probably more than others. The subject of censorship. Let me first put it in context again. Because of everything we've just said in the first half of your show, people publishing critical research, going up for promotion at a university, and then getting whacked for doing it, other academics become fearful, justifiably so. So do I then, publish about, critical research on the Quran or other sensitive issues within Islamic history and tradition? And, the question is, does this happen? And of course, I think we would say in many Muslim countries, I would say now less so. Again, if we can get a chance to come back to how things have changed in traditional Muslim societies, that would be great. But in the Western context, I could say a few things. It's again an area I think that the question itself is nascent as far as is there enough research? I don't think there is. So I can say anecdotally a little bit that one little story I can say is I'm part of many listservs, as I'm sure you are. Academic listservs of folks who do Islamic studies, biblical studies, Quran studies, Syriac studies, around the world. And the main heft of that is really sort of North America and Europe, because that's where the resources are. And for the most part, I would say we enjoy a level of freedom unparalleled anywhere else in the world. You know, I think that if I here sitting in my armchair in Houston, Texas, cannot publish, you know, comfortably about Quranic studies or late antiquity or pre-Islamic Arabia or early Islam, you know, if I can't do it here, I can't do it anywhere. So I'm very grateful and fortunate that I have that privilege to do so, and I recognize it. That doesn't mean that there are not episodes here and there. There always are. When my book on the Quran and the Aramaic gospel traditions came out, you know, there was some discussion, you know, over Facebook. It was actually in German. I got to, you know, enjoy some discussion in German about some folks who said, you know, will there be a fatwa against this author? And there wasn't. You know, it was just some discussion. But that's what people expect with each new publication, even if it comes from the West. But that, I think, was, again, from someone from within the traditional societies. I think it was Morocco or something like that. But within the listservs, I would, within these listservs, especially there's one listserv of, you know, young Muslim academics in Europe and North America. I would express my critical views critically and respectfully. This is what I always tell my students. You can say anything in this world if you're respectful and critical at the same time. Be gentle and speak the truth. And, you know, one example was, I would say that, you know, a hadith about, you know, the women in hellfire hanging by their hair. This is something that is, no, it's not historical. And I don't think that a prophet or any individual actually said this thing. I think it's sort of this trope that is repeated over and over again and has some roots in, you know, rabbinic or Zoroastrian tradition. And of course, I was attacked for that. That's a very small example, but that happens all the time. So that happens, but then I get several messages privately. This is where your question comes in, saying, oh, Emran, I'm so glad you said something, because you know, a lot of us are just too afraid to come out of our shell and say it. There is a large wellspring, you know, beneath the academy of academics who wants to be more critical and be more, I think, just, you know, playing with their language about how they speak about the Quran and its appearance, its editing, its publication, its dissemination, but they don't. Maybe they can't, but I think it's mainly that they don't, because it's complicated. Part of it is, again, fear of judgment from within the community. Part of it, as you will know, Gabriel, of course, is, you know, the problem of Islamophobia, which is real. So that does exist. Another couple of things, if you permit me. ICSA, again, the organization that we've co-founded, the International Quranic Studies Association. It's an organization which I think we have now, you know, a decade under our belt of conferences, of journal articles, of books, of you know, a community of scholars and friends that you, Gabriel, have helped build. And lessons learned. We haven't always done things right, but there are a couple of things that come to mind. We've had, I recall very well, since the very beginning, scholars from traditional Muslim institutions like Al-Azhar, from institutions from several different universities in Saudi Arabia, you know, Morocco, Tunisia, Iran, if they could get a visa. That's another issue, right? And of course, Indonesia, a large Muslim population there, of course. So the appetite for critical intellectual approaches to the Quran is immense, but it does take bravery. And that bravery is not always there. That courage is not always there among some of our academics. But I would, again, I have to be careful with what I say, because there's a lot of critical research that is published all the time. I sometimes do feel a little bit lonely, to be honest with you, as you know, as a Muslim academic who writes about critical studies in the Quran, because there are not many conversation partners. There are people to the right of me and to the left of me, but there are very few people who are in my circle. One last thing I'm going to mention. We already mentioned his name real quickly, but Muhammad Arkoun was a brilliant man, a scholar who, again, published in French and in Arabic. He was, I think, Algérien Français, right? He was he was Algerian French, and that hybrid identity assisted him in his intellectual capacity, which was incredible. He has this text, "لا مفكر في الفكر الإسلامي المعاصر," right? So the unthought in contemporary Islamic thought. The unthought. In French, he has, of course, Penser l'Islam aujourd'hui, right? So he's very concerned about Islamic thought today. Yes, any one of us can memorize a bunch of texts if we practice very, very hard and just repeat them like parrots. which at this point is hugely problematic. And I think that, we're a lot of scholars recognize, and we're moving away from that, generally speaking. So then what is Islamic thought then? If we're moving away, what is it? So what is the unthought? The unthought for Muhammad Arkun it's going very deep into your question. Where are the deep, dark crevices where people have censored themselves and are not publishing about the Quran or about the Turath, about Muhammad or Ali or Fatima? Where, we don't know because it's not published, right? So that's an article. It's a book that I would encourage everyone to take a look at. One last thing about this is he, of course, uses the method of deconstructionism derived from Jacques Derrida, the French social scientist, which again is very problematic because it's the word deconstructionist. It's the D word. It's a bad word, right? He uses, of course, linguistics, which is a social science, and philology to sort of dismember tradition. But then what do you do after it? I'm of course not doing justice to it, but these are some of my ideas about censorship and self-censorship when we're talking about Quranic studies. That it does have a long history, and there's a large unspoken group of people who are hidden, unfortunately.
Before we conclude, Dr. Badawi, can I ask you to follow up on the point you made about current trends in the Arab Islamic world in regard to freedom of expression and religion?
Yeah.
To things changing and maybe there being more openness, more diversity of thought.
So a couple of things. Thank you again, Gabriel, for letting me come back to this. And this is not very, highbrow stuff. So on the one hand, we do have, publications that, again, the majority of which come out in Western languages, English, French, German, other languages. But we also do have stuff that comes out in Arabic, like I just mentioned to you. There is, I think, more scholarship in Arabic that is valuable, that is intellectually vibrant, that we're not really tapping into. That's something that me and Fred and you have talked about a lot, actually. That's one. On the other hand, there's, of course, there is, we have YouTube channels like this amazing channel that you have on exploring the Quran and Bible, Gabriel. But when we also have, I mentioned this in the article, you have figures like Islam Bahiri and, Hamid Abdul Samad, these characters who are within Egypt, outside of Egypt. Hamid Abdul Samad started his channel in Germany, and I think describes himself as a sort of an ex-Muslim, and he was, harshly treated. So he was very harsh with Islam. He has a book on Islamofascism, and it's sort of weird. But in recent years, he's come back to Egypt. He's allowed to be in Egypt and show up on TV and do a show. We also have, of course, Mukhtalaf Ali Ibrahim Aisa's show, which you were on, Gabriel. So things are changing within the academy, on social media, on television, live television itself. These are all, I think, good things. And that does not mean that we're out of the woods. I'll mention one last publication. It's that of Naveen Rida and Yasmin Amin, both Egyptian academics living abroad, on Islamic interpretive tradition and gender justice, looking at tafsir and gender justice. We had the benefit of having them at ICSA in Palermo, Sicily, beautiful location. It was an enormous roundtable. It really was a historic event of female colleagues talking about this question of gender and interpretation and so on and so forth. It was fascinating because of just how diverse it was, and even bewildering, and how much I learned and a lot of us learned. But the book itself, I think was banned or is banned in Egypt today, right? So we still have the same problem. And this is why I mentioned in the article that, the more repression that we practice, the more people are sort of will turn away or turn inward with respect to their own religion and their faith and their identity. So I hope that within everything that I've mentioned, there is some coherence and something good. But otherwise, I apologize if I went on for too long.
Thank you so much, Emran. Really, we covered a lot of ground, and it shows your agility in thinking through intellectual and academic questions, also historical and sociological questions. This was terrific. And if you'd like to learn more, of Dr. Badawi's thought, this is your time. Go right now to that big bookstore or somewhere else and find Queens and Prophets, published by One World in 2022. Highly recommended, along with his other works, including the Qur'an and Aramaic Gospel traditions, published by Routledge. Otherwise, to stay in touch with your work, how should they do that?
Luckily, I don't have a lot of friends, not as many as people think. I think most of my friends are when I meet them at conferences and at trade shows. So I'm on Twitter, I'm on academia.edu, I'm on LinkedIn. So I try to stay active on social media.
Great. Thank you so much, Emran. I look forward to having you back another time.
Thank you, Gabriel. It's been an honor.
Well, friends, thanks for being with us for this episode of Exploring the Quran and the Bible. I hope you found it to be an edifying discussion. I really hope that you find generally the content on this channel to be useful. There's a really diverse range of things in regard to Quranic studies and biblical studies with top-notch scholars. And we'll be really grateful for your support. So please don't hesitate to like the videos, starting with this one maybe, to subscribe to the channel and to share the news with your friends about exploring the Quran and the Bible.